Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. My guest today is Peter Maurer. He is the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. He joins us via satellite from Geneva. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Maurer, you're just back from a visit in Myanmar and to Bangladesh to try to look at the situation of the Rohingya, this minority in Myanmar that was essentially persecuted by the military just a year ago. Some 700,000 are now stranded at the border with Bangladesh, but you went to Rakhine state where they used to live. What did you see there? Is the repression continuing? Is there an improvement of the situation on the ground?
What we can see in Rakhine State, in particular in northern Rakhine, is indeed signs of the violence and displacements of last year. We see land flattened, villages flattened, houses abandoned, communities disrupted, markets disrupted, the economy lying down. There are still people living in Rakhine from all the communities, Muslim, Hindu, Rakhine communities living in northern Rakhine. A couple of 100,000 still living. We have been able to access some of them over the last couple of months and to bring basic humanitarian assistance to those remaining. The situation overall has calmed down in terms of violence, but because of the outrageous event last year, there is still a lot of suspicion, there is a lot of fear amongst the populations that violence may resurge and may again displace those who are there. So there is not a stable situation. This is a highly fragile context in which ICRC is amongst a few organizations being able to mount and to respond, mount a humanitarian organization and to respond to needs of people.
There was a deal struck by Bangladesh and Myanmar back in January to essentially return some of the hundreds of thousands stranded at the border in camps in Bangladesh to Myanmar. However, the UN Human Rights Chief declared that not a single person has returned under this program. Do you think that this is something feasible? Given the situation you described, can they return home?
Well, if you ask me whether they should return home, I would say yes, of course they should be able to return home. If you ask me whether they are returning home because conditions are there to return home, then I would clearly say no. At the present moment, neither the economic conditions nor the infrastructural conditions, given the destruction of the villages and houses, are reunited to receive a larger number of people back in Rakhine State, nor the inter-community relations are really at the point where people would be safe to go back. And my meetings also and in visiting Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh on the other side, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of refugees who were there, and they are not going to go back unless there is a more comprehensive agreement on security, but also on status of their citizenship in Rakhine State. So at the present moment, this is kind of a virtual agreement which reflects political will but has no substance in terms of being a guide for larger scale returns.
Well, you met with the leaders of the Myanmar, and including the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aung San Suu Kyi. I imagine you discussed all the issue, including the issue of citizenship. We know that they are not granted citizenship in Myanmar, the Rohingyas, but you said you were encouraged, quote unquote. Why were you encouraged? Because the repression is less visible now, or maybe the government is realizing it needs to maybe take care of those Rohingyas and maybe give them more rights?
Well, definitely there is an encouragement that I perceived, in a sense that there is a recognition of the deep impact that violence had on northern Rakhine societies, about the displacements, the disruptions, and there is a willingness to take people back. At least the civilian government of Aung San Suu Kyi has expressed itself very clearly that those who have fled to Bangladesh should be able to return. So this is positive as such. I think the status issue as well as the issue around rights is of course a highly political issue. What I said as a humanitarian organization is that even for longer term humanitarian assistance, it will be important that people have rights, economic rights, the rights to go to market, to move around, to rehabilitate their houses, and this will not be possible without a change in course also of policies which create conditions conducive to return. I think in terms again of political declaration, I see a lot of willingness to work towards this objective. In terms of reality, there is still a long way to go to create conditions which will allow the Rohingyas to go back.
I want to turn now to Syria. The focus now is on the southern region of Deraa at the border of Jordan and Israel. The regime and its allies are essentially fighting what's left, and that's not a lot, of the opposition, creating a humanitarian situation at the border with Jordan and Israel. Some 300,000 people have been displaced. However, Israel and Jordan said they would not open the border. Are you asking them to do so?
Well, what we see is indeed a very difficult situation for the civilian population. Unsurprisingly, with the intensification of the combats again in the south, a lot of people have been displaced. They are trapped in between the front lines and the borders, which are hermetically closed. There are offers, of course, of corridors to escape these difficult situations towards Syria, but I fear that this is not enough, and we hope that the neighbouring countries will soften their stance on the border. And while we certainly can understand the difficult situation in which they are themselves, because they are host countries, in particular Jordan, of a number of Syrian refugees, of a big number of Syrian refugees, we still believe that this is an emergency situation which needs a more subtle and a more flexible approach in allowing the refugees trapped in between the lines to go to safe places.
We see that the regime is nearly in control now of the country. I want to ask you, do you think that the humanitarian situation is improving, actually, in the areas where the government has retaken control, however brutally?
Well, we certainly have a very different picture unfolding at the present moment in Syria. We have in many parts of Syria still a very precarious humanitarian situation. On other parts of Syria, indeed, people are trying to return back to their homes, to rehabilitate some of the basic infrastructures and to find some normalcy. But I wanted nevertheless to recall we have a unique disruption and a unique disintegration of the social and economic fabrics of Syria due to the combats over the last couple of years. We are far away from any sort of normal life that people are finding. What we see from the most destructed cities in Syria is that a lot will have to be done to go back to something which is normal, not even to think about going back to pre-war situations. We see the images and we are ourselves present in Aleppo, in Homs, in some of the most destructive part of Syria. We are far away from any normalcy, even if the threats to life and livelihoods is not as immediate in some parts of Syria as it is in the south, on which we have spoken just before.
The last issue I want to talk about in Yemen, the situation is dire from a humanitarian standpoint. You decided to pull out 71 staff members in June because of threats. We'll remind our viewers that ICRC staff member was killed in June. How dangerous it is, and do you consider pulling out totally from Yemen?
Well, you know that ICRC's license to operate at the end of the day comes from consensus building amongst all parties in a conflict. We had serious and immediate threats to some of our colleagues, which put us into the impossible situation of having to pull out some of our staff in Yemen in order just to escape a difficult security situation. This is unfortunate because it happened at a moment when the humanitarian situation once again accentuated and the problems became more visible through the intensification of warfare around Hodeidah. We hope that we can find an agreement with the parties to again go back to full-fledged presence. I wanted nevertheless to recall that we are still present in Yemen and we are sustaining our operations despite the fact that 71 of our staff have been relocated to Djibouti. They are ready to go back to Yemen as soon as we have satisfactory security arrangements. More than 60 of our staff, our international staff, are still there and try to deliver in a satisfactory way to the humanitarian challenges with which we are confronted. So we hope that we can go back, and we really don't want to leave a country which is in a very dire situation at the present moment.
Peter Maurer, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for watching this interview here on France 24. Stay tuned for more news.